Minutes in this lecture on religion in North Africa over the past 60 years, the one thing I want you all to take away, the most important fact perhaps in terms of the course and any consideration of Islam, I would argue, is the variety that exists. I think it's particularly important for you here because you're all at Sais and you're all going to go on to do terribly important things, right? Excellent. In influential positions. And it's a constant struggle to get across to people in positions of power in the West the difference that exists within Islam, because we're talking about individuals, not just entities. They're not names, they're not labels, they are people. So, as you all know, because it was on the syllabus, the title for this evening's lecture, Islam is the answer. What is the question? I don't need you to answer this now, but I will ask the question, so I put it into your head at the beginning. Does anybody know who coined the expression Islam is the answer? Or indeed what it means, or what it refers to? Show of hands, yes? Anybody know the origin? Oh, good. I won't give away all my best material in the intro then. So, our outline as always. The outlines for previous lectures have been fairly straightforward. We've had names, for instance, of presidents or heads of state when looking at Egypt or Libya. As we move into these thematic lectures, the ideas are more fluid. And I hope our thinking will be too, a little sharper, but drawing on everything we've learnt up to this point. So 3 parts: in opposition, in power, in crisis, question mark, and a very easy conclusion for you to take away. So our introduction. You can't see the figures perhaps in the bar at the bottom here, but quite obviously the darker the colour, the higher the percentage of Muslims living in any one country. The light blue over the United States of America has the figure 0.8%. Those are figures from the Pew Research Council for the American Muslim population, which is the equivalent to just under 3 million people in America. And I am talking about Americans now, not immigrants who have yet to become American citizens or such. Are these illustrations useful? I suppose it's a yes and no answer. It's quite instructive to see shades on a map to make something very immediately obvious. But as I said, the first point to remember is the difference. So while these are, I believe, useful illustrations that make something obvious, they also obscure a great deal of difference. Middle East, North Africa, our area of interest. You can see the figures are between 90 and 100% for Muslim populations. And here they are by country. In Egypt, a very paltry 90% of the population self-identify as Muslims. Why is it lowest in Egypt of all the countries in North Africa? Because of the Copts. Yeah, Coptic Christians who number between 9 and 10%. It's something nobody's exactly sure of, but the Coptic population of Egypt remains, and has done for centuries, the largest Christian population in the Middle East. So in Libya, 97%, Tunisia, there's a very accurate figure here from 2011 of 99.8%, and in even more, surprisingly, in Morocco perhaps, 99.9%. All of these figures have gone up in the past 60 years. All of these figures are higher today than they were in the colonial period, because... Anyone? Why would we have higher figures today?
Colonists left.
Colonists left, thank you. How many left Algeria? Huh?
Almost all of them.
Almost all of them. Do you remember the figure? Close to 1 million. Close to 1 million Pieds Noirs, or French settlers, left. That had a massive impact. In Morocco, the number of settlers was lower than in other countries. But the biggest loss to Morocco, arguably, since independence, was the loss of the Jewish population. It's true across North Africa, but in Morocco it was particularly stark and particularly obvious, many of whom had been living in Morocco since the 15th, 16th century, when the Jewish populations were expelled from Spain. So another very long historical connection. Another very useful and useful chart, but also one that hides a great deal of detail. The different schools of Islamic jurisprudence. This one's useful, I think, for showing you very clearly great differences. Now, none of these lines are absolute, except where governments are self-avowedly belonging to one or another Islamic school. But it's not the case, as we know well, that every one of the countries has an Islamic government, or indeed one that focuses solely on one school of jurisprudence or another. Again, our area of interest has the sparsest population of any of the majority Muslim nations. And as always, don't worry about this illustration too much, because the slides will be available tomorrow. So what do we see, though, for North Africa, and indeed Muslim Africa in general? We're looking at the Maliki school of Islam, generally fairly conservative. That said, it's again too easy a simplification to make. We will look later at distinctions such as Sufi Islam. Does anybody know where the word Sufi comes from, or how we identify Sufis, or how Sufis choose to self-identify?
It means wool.
Mm-hmm.
It means wool.
Comes from the word for wool, yes, suf, because of the woolen cloaks the adherents were supposed to wear once upon a time. Can anybody categorize Sufi Islam in a word or two?
Kind of pass the teachings down, like within kind of, I guess, brotherhoods from like one leader to the next.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, the idea of brotherhoods is very important in Sufism. It's also very seen as the esoteric or mystical or inner form of Islam. This does not mean, however, that all Sufis are passive observers of the world around them, living like one might imagine Christian monks in isolation. They are very active in the world. In the same way that those who are non-Sufis, indeed those who challenge Sufis for supremacy in Morocco particularly, Tunisia, southern Tunisia, those who speak out against Sufism are not all political actors either. None of these categorizations are hard and fast in North Africa or indeed anywhere in the region. Yes?
I didn't understand the relationship between Sufism and Maliki.
Well, good point. Any one of these schools of Islamic jurisprudence have Sufi schools within them. You don't have to belong to one school of Islamic jurisprudence to be Sufi. And indeed, there are Sufi followers who don't follow any school of Islamic jurisprudence, but indeed one of the others. You have Shia Sufi as much as you have Sunni Sufis. Although when I say as much, that's actually a little wide of the mark. There are far more Sunni Sufis than there are Shia Sufis, but they exist. And indeed, most of the great writers from the 11th and 12th century on Sufi mysticism came from the Persian Empire. So there is a very interesting link between Shia Islam and Sufi, and indeed Shia Islam has fed into a lot of Sunni Sufi practices, but I'm afraid that's for another day. And I'm sure that you'd all love to have a lecture on that, perhaps in the months ahead. So part one in opposition. Two periods we're going to have in mind very broadly. And when I think about religion in North Africa and the word opposition, I am of course thinking of political opposition, not in opposition to other faith groups, although that would be a lecture in itself. Because to my mind, the debates that are raging at the moment about Islam in North Africa are all revolving around questions of power. They might be framed in questions of religion, but they're all contesting elections. So when you see a newspaper headline or a comment headline that asks, are Islam and democracy compatible? Is it possible to be Muslim and democratic? You simply have to look at the newspaper and not the comment section to see that Islamic groups across North Africa are and have been contesting elections at some level since the end of the colonial period. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, when it was founded in the 1920s, was keen to be a political organisation from day one. It was prohibited from doing so, of course, and the leadership imprisoned. But it was always part of the Brotherhood's aims and goals to be a political party. In Algeria, when you look at the FLN, who kicked the French out, they were never avowedly an Islamic party. They were the most secular of all the anti-colonial parties in North Africa. And yet, they spoke out very forcefully against things like smoking and alcohol. Not because it was anti-Islamic, but because it was introduced by the French. It's very interesting, at the same time in Algeria, they didn't speak out against the French language, because all the leadership of the FLN were French speakers. So there's another obvious foreign import that they were able to overlook. At the same time, they had to bring in teachers of Arabic from other parts of the Islamic world. The majority of those teachers of Arabic who ended up in Algeria came from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, two countries that had a much more conservative tradition in education and in Islam. So what happened? There was the growth not only of an Islamist opposition in Algeria from the 1960s on, but it was the growth in a much more radical Islamic opposition to what they saw as a secular government of post-French Algeria. And the other period that's important to remember, of course, is what's happening today. Post-colonial, if you like, the Arab uprisings, what's been happening. A lot of these parties are no longer in opposition, and suddenly they found other Islamist opposition groups to counter the political sphere. Let's just go back very quickly to consider a couple of these names that we've had in the past. Who remembers as far back as Algeria? Abdul Qadir. What do Americans remember about Abdul Qadir, having been told about it by Eamonn? Anyone? Do you remember a gift he was presented by a rather well-known American president?
And you give him a pistol,
Right. President Abraham Lincoln presented Abdul Qadir, the great anti-colonial resistance fighter, with a pair of pistols in 1861 after his defense of Christians in Damascus, where the French had expelled him. He was a Sufi. He was a warrior. So again, just get it into your heads that Sufi doesn't always mean esoteric, mystical, non-gun wielding type of Muslim. It's not the case. He was a teacher of the Quran. He was also a warrior par excellence, a great guerrilla fighter, and also a man who defended the Christians in Damascus, not because it was going to win him any favours with the American president, but because it was the right thing to do. Omar Mukhtar, of course, the #1 hero in the Libyan resistance movement, resisting the Italian invasion. Quranic teacher in a village school. Sanussi, we remember the name? King Idris al-Sanussi. The Sanussi are still very influential in eastern Libya today. But again, the Sanussi are seen as something of a political organisation during the time of the Italians, resisting the occupation. They're seen as an educational centre of education with the great university in Jabub that Colonel Gaddafi bulldozed. But they were also seen as rather esoteric and otherworldly at the same time. So at the same time they were fighting the Italians and later the British, they were also setting up educational establishments and the social provision which is so common in Egypt of the Muslim Brotherhood today, and also indeed through Hamas and Hezbollah east of our territories, social provision on top of the religious messages. The most prominent and most successful of all Muslim revivalist groups of the 20th century is without doubt the Muslim Brotherhood. I should say that although these groups that started, the Sanussi, the Brotherhood, Hamas and Hezbollah, they were all in some sense resistance movements and Islamist revivalist movements, they are not a modern phenomena. The first Islamist revival movement started less than 80 years after the death of Mohammed. He died in 632. So don't think of these as being new phenomena. Islamist revivalism has always been in place. It's just the actions of a next generation coming along, looking back to a time when things were better. You must have heard it said that nostalgia ain't what it used to be. Well, this is often the case with religions. They're not static things. It doesn't matter how often somebody tells you that this religion has never changed. It has changed every day of its life, and it will continue to do so. It would be very easy, I think, for everyone in this room to understand changes in Christianity, for example, because it's an idiom with which we're more familiar. If you think about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has that been around forever? No. It's a 19th century interpretation of the faith. Scientology, a 20th century interpretation of the faith. Now, there will always be debate about whether those are Christian churches or not, but they certainly identify themselves as Christian churches, and it's exactly the same in Islam. But they're constantly changing, they're constantly reinventing themselves, generally looking back. The importance of looking back for Hassan al-Banna, as much as it was for Omar Mukhtar, was to get validation for your new ideas. You don't want these ideas to be seen as new. You want to be seen as pure, and purity is often seen as the 7th century model of Muhammad and his followers in the Arabian Peninsula. So, I asked earlier if anybody knew the origins of the phrase Islam is the answer. It was Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, it's overtly religious in intent. Islam is the first word in this expression. But it was also a political slogan from 1928. That's the food poisoning kicking in now. So Islam is the answer. So what is the question? As I said, it was a political slogan. Hassan al-Banna's argument was that in the Quran and in the traditions of the Prophet, one had all the answers to life's problems, all the challenges of life. All you needed to do was have it interpreted correctly. Of course, this meant by Hassan al-Banna. So often is the case. People who start these new groups are the ones who have the answer. It's rather convenient how that works, isn't it? It's been tried in other parts of the world, of course. Post-1979 and the so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran, Islam is the answer was a slogan reinvented by the Shia clerics there. So that when they question things like, should we have traffic lights in Tehran? People say, well, let's turn to Islam for the answer. Of course, there's not a great deal in the Quran about traffic lights. And yet, they keep saying Islam is the answer, Islam is the answer. There are clerics in Iran, for example, who have ruled against the rules of association football because the way it's done in the West is considered haram. Haram being the Islamic term for forbidden. Well, of course, there's no prohibition on how one plays football or doesn't play football in the Quran. But again, the power brokers will use this as a political tool. So, in just the same way when we looked at economics, and Willis was very keen to point out that economics was a political tool, try not to get away from the idea of religion as a political tool. And talking of political tools, Sayyid Qutb here. If the Muslim Brotherhood are the most powerful organisation in the 20th century Islamist revivals, Sayyid Qutb is without question the most influential. He's probably most influential because of his execution at the hands of the Egyptian state in 1966. In his death, his martyrdom, as his followers would see it, he left behind a model of what people should strive to. Martyrdom. He has had, I say he's the most influential because it was his ideas that were taken up by Eamonn al-Zawahiri, who is now the head of al-Qaeda. His ideas were taken up by Osama bin Laden, a name which doesn't need any explanation. Now, again, Osama bin Laden and Eamonn al-Zawahiri reinterpreted the words of Sayyid Qutb to serve their own ends and for their own time period. Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s, when Qutb was active, is not the same as Egypt today, is not the same as Afghanistan anytime. Also very important, always remember the context and the time about which one is talking. And everything we've seen so far in the history between the end of the colonial period and today has been nationalism at the forefront of political movements in North Africa. And I think it's important to keep nationalism in mind, even though we're looking at religion. the national religious movements in each country across the region were very distinct because of their national origins. I put the word Qutubism up here because that is what people who follow him now, how they are now identified, if not always self-identified. Salafi, a term you all are familiar with too. Be careful about using Salafi. It's not just one thing. There are those Salafists who promote violence. There are those Salafists who would bring down national governments. There are those Salafists who are more like you might imagine the Sufis to be. There are, believe it or not, esoteric Salafists, those who want to retreat from the world, to study the Quran, who believe that Islam is the answer, that all will be sorted out by Islam one day, but they want nothing to do with politics because it's a human invention. There are other Salafist groups, of course, that we see every day in the newspapers who are contesting elections very, very vigorously. So when you see Salafi, don't be fooled into thinking you're looking at one thing and not another. Another character that we've looked at very briefly, the so-called blind sheikh, another Qutubist. This again is why Sayyid Qutb is a character you must at least have some knowledge of. We all remember what this chap was responsible for or convicted for. The 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. Excuse me. And in this gallery of influential, important Muslims, I think it's instructive to have this picture of Mohammed VI of Morocco here. He is the leader of the faithful in Morocco. His form of Islam is obviously very different to that of many of the others we've seen earlier this evening. Why is that? Mohammed VI and his family claim direct descent from Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. The fact is, they don't want any religious political opposition groups because they are the state. Yes, there have been constitutional changes made in Morocco in the past 2 years which have introduced a degree of democracy that was previously unknown in that country. But if you travel to Morocco, as I know some of you have, pictures of Mohammed VI will be displayed very prominently indeed. He is the state, he is the religion. So in power. This is an image one doesn't see every day. It's a king voting for himself. It's a very curious idea, and again in the modern world this is how things have changed. I'm reminded of the life of Brian, isn't it, where he's explaining, who are you? And he says, I am your king. And he said, well, I didn't vote for you. He said, you don't vote for king. Well, actually you do now. You're not voting for the king, but the constitutional changes that Mohammed VI suggested, he voted on, and what do you know, it passed very healthily. He remains head of the armed forces in Morocco. He is in power for the foreseeable future. People ask why the Arab uprisings, or the Arab Spring so-called, hasn't arrived in Morocco. It has. What it hasn't done is topple the regime. There's been so much invested in the Alawite dynasties for the past close to 400 years now, that people generally have a favourable view of him. It's not to say there's an opposition, but they don't want the removal of the royal family. There have been protests, we've mentioned those before. There have been self-immolations. There is too much unemployment in Morocco, there's too much cronyism, and if we believe everything we read in WikiLeaks, there is a great degree of corruption which involves this man personally. But still, I think his position is fairly secure, partly because of his association with the Prophet Muhammad. Who cares to name this man for me? Granouchi, very good. From? Very good. A man who spent a great deal of time in opposition and whose party is now in power in Tunisia. It's interesting, isn't it? Every time there's an election, whether it's in America or any other part of the world, we listen to the sloganeering of politicians, and when they get into power we say, oh, they didn't promise that, or oh, they failed to follow through on what they said they were going to do. Well, of course they had, because when they were in opposition, they didn't have the power. And now that they have the power, they don't want to go back to being in opposition. So I think it's very human to do what one can to hold on to the power. Hopefully, that would mean doing a better job of running the country, whichever country that may be. Very often the problems are insurmountable. In Egypt today, I would like to shake Mohammed Morsi by the hand, frankly, and wish him very best of luck. I'm glad that the job of president of that country is not mine. They need to create millions of jobs. They have great human capital, but they have no foreign investment. In Tunisia, the problems are perhaps less acute because the unemployment is slightly lower, the population is lower, but then their potential is that much lower too. They don't have the oil and gas reserves that Egypt has. They don't have the same revenue from tourism, and of course they don't have the Suez Canal. When Ghannouchi started out in Islamist politics in 1981, he was not as keen on democracy as he claims to be today. And I don't use the word claims to be to stir any controversy. I just think that since 1981, Ghannouchi's views have changed. And if somebody's views change, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I know there's this dreadful expression about flip-flopping in American politics. But it was a British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who once said, "It's better to be right than consistent." I think that's an indication that things change, circumstances change. He's a lot older than he was in 1981. That in itself makes a great deal of difference. And all of the political leaders that we're going to look at now, whether they're in Morocco, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, they're all older than when they were in opposition. Makes a great deal of difference. I put this chap's name up because I'm not sure that you would recognise him. Was I wrong? You would have recognised him. No. Jibril, National Forces Alliance in Libya. The situation in Libya is unique, I think, in North Africa. Everybody in the West has been jumping up and down about Islamist political parties winning the elections in Egypt and Tunisia. And then they said, well, why didn't that happen in Libya? Well, the fact was that when Mahmoud Jibril was out electioneering, he was able to hold up the Quran as well and say, hey, I'm not running as an Islamist, I'm a Muslim, I don't have to prove anything. And I think that really did pull the rug out from underneath the Islamist parties. In the other countries that we've considered, Tunisia and Egypt, there's been a much longer tradition of secular politics. In Libya, under Gaddafi particularly, there was no such thing as secular politics. There was no official opposition. But it's not to suggest that Libyans are that much more conservative. It's just that without a tradition of secular politics, Jibril was able to say, we're all hoping to have a form of law based on Sharia, based on the Quran. And so the Islamist parties had nothing to point at. It's very interesting in Libya with their savings account, as we described it, rather than the economy. Their oil and gas will allow the more moderate Islamist parties, I think, to remain in power for a great deal longer than the Muslim Brotherhood will be in power in Egypt. I don't know if the Brotherhood will give up power willingly after the next election, but in 10 years' time, I would not expect to see them playing the part they do in Egyptian politics today. You heard it here first. Talking about Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, of course. It's interesting how many of these leaders today, the current generation of leaders, have spent time in prisons in their own countries too. I should have said, actually, when we looked at Mahmoud Jibril, he was one that got out early. I think he's the only one who hasn't spent time in prison, but he was in self-imposed exile for 30 years under Gaddafi, and indeed, as an opposition leader overseas, commissioned an assassination attempt against Gaddafi, so don't be fooled by the sharp suit. Now that he's in power, we await to see if he will still be commissioning assassinations at home or abroad. But on to Morsi. Morsi in opposition, people have said, was a nobody. They've described him within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood as a non-entity, a factotum. It's not the case. Mohammed Morsi was very important in the Muslim Brotherhood. Obviously, they didn't pick a nobody. They picked somebody that was perhaps relatively unknown in the West, but he was one of the main enforcers in the Muslim Brotherhood itself. In any political/religious organization, there will be differences of opinion. When one of your members strays from the true path as set down by yourself, you have to go and discipline them. You have to encourage them or cajole them to thinking more in line with the party. That was the job of Mohammed Morsi. It's very interesting that since he's got power, he's been singularly unable to play the same role. He has not been able to cajole, force or bully the Egyptians into following their line. And indeed, the more dictatorial the party appears to be in power, and the less interested it seems to be in talking to people, the weaker they're becoming. This again is not untypical when you look at political movements. You get a great deal of power very suddenly. It's the thing which weakens them most. In Libya, the National Transitional Council, now called the General National Congress, is much more conciliatory. They had seats allocated for minorities. They had seats allocated for women. Now, they might just be suckers, you say. Well, you know, it's just the window dressing. It doesn't really mean anything. But in Libya today, you do have a much more equitable system of government without the mass protests. You also, of course, have religious militias in Libya who are making it very difficult for the central government to exercise effective power nationwide. But within the political arena, the official political arena, things are far healthier in Libya than they are in either of the neighbouring countries. In crisis, question mark. We've seen him already once. Islamist politics, Islamist parties, and Islam in North Africa. In our day, is it in crisis? Is there a simple answer? What do you think? Of course not. I never offer simple answers. You could point to Hassan al-Banna, a man who was assassinated by the Egyptian state. Well, it's never been proved, but nobody else was doing assassinations in the 1940s in Egypt but the Egyptian state. The success of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and some of its spin-offs, such as the MTI in Tunisia, which is definitely inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, their success in elections, you would say, proves definitively that they have come out on top. They have won the struggle for supremacy that is a constant struggle anywhere in the world. But what have they got for their pains? Egypt today is a far less secure country than it was under the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. With freedom, there comes opportunity. For the government, there comes headaches. And as I say, relying too much on the idea of religion as the answer is proving, I think, to be to the detriment of the Muslim Brotherhood more than anything else. It's suggested that the Salafists, the more extreme Muslim political parties in Egypt, will win a great deal more seats in the next election. I don't know that Egyptians are going to become more radicalized or not. During the period of colonial occupation, all of these parties were very strong because they were in opposition to a foreign power. It's very easy when you've been invaded to point to the British, the French or the Italians and say, we're anything that they're not. Essentially, whatever it is, we're against it. That was a very easy policy to effect. Post-independence, when the foreigners all left, those countries which had the more secular governments, such as Algeria, also had the strongest Islamist opposition. And again, it was being said by the Islamist political parties, you're not Islamic enough. And it has not too subtly, and not so gradually, shoved the whole Islamic agenda of North Africa much further to the extremes. It's not to say there isn't space for moderate Islamist political parties in North Africa today. It has been seen in Libya, as I mentioned. But I think there is definitely a crisis of positioning in the Islamic faith in North Africa today. Quick test for you all. Come on, who would get them all? Who would get one of them? Help me. Wes?
King Mohammed.
Very good, excellent. King Mohammed. You don't have to take them in order, people. We've just been looking at Egypt.
Morsi.
Very good. Wes has got two. Two for zero.
Ganushi?
Hmm? Heads of state. Let me stand aside, honey. This is the one we haven't looked at tonight. Bouteflika. There's a good reason for that. It's because he never makes any claims to Islam being the answer. It's also the country in which there has been least change since the start of these Arab uprisings across the region. I don't know if you're writing these names down, are you? No, good. The crisis again. It's not just a crisis in Egypt for the Egyptians, it's a crisis across the region, it's a crisis across all of the Middle East. It's also an international crisis. And when I talk about an international crisis, it's because too often in the West, again, we look to these famous, influential characters like Qutb, most influential, but in a very narrow sphere, as is this man. We can't ignore them. They're not going away. Well, he is. He's going away. He's been put away for life, but the movements are not going away. This chap, his death has been confirmed. Anybody recognise that name? Do you recognise the surname? Al-Libi. I know you're not all Arabists in the room, but could anybody make an educated stab as to what Al-Libi might mean? The Libyan. Excellent. Abu Yahya al-Libi. It's got a nice ring about it, hasn't it? Abu Yahya al-Libi. Abu Yahya, the Libyan. He was killed in Waziristan, which is somewhat east of our region of interest. But he was significant because he was seen, a Libyan, he was indeed from Libya, as one of the new spiritual heads and military heads of al-Qaeda. Mukhtar Mukhtar. Don't know if he's dead. The Chadian army said they killed him on the 2nd or 3rd of March this year. In circumstances, shall we say, that are far from clear at the moment. The Chadian government are the only government that are saying he is dead, but they've not yet produced his remains. So I'm saying that he might still be wandering around in the Sahara. This is the sort of crisis that's taking place in Islamist politics in North Africa, though. It's being dominated by people like Mukhtar Mukhtar and Abu Yahya. Now, I'm not saying that because he's wearing a uniform, Wes, he's a good example to us all. This is the stability that people in Morocco have enjoyed. This is the good face, if you like, of Moroccan stability. In Algeria, of course, you have the non-Islamist military rulers who've now taken off their uniforms in exchange for pinstripe suits. This is a very negative form of stability, as said by the Algerian people. But we saw what happened in the 1990s in Algeria when the Islamists were about to win power and that civilian government ended the second round of elections. It led to the death of 100,000 people at least. This is why things are not going to change in Algeria in the same way, at least for the foreseeable future. Crisis. Again, for anybody in power in North Africa, and this is Sanussi, of course, from a different angle, just in case you get too used to seeing him with a flag behind him. I don't want you just to think he's got a flag behind him all the time. He does appear in other poses. The crisis, again, is one of management. It's not just about faith. They're not losing their faith, but they have to have it redefined in the new political realities that exist in North Africa today. And Mohammed Magarief. I didn't put on the right, it should be obvious to you all. His problems in Libya are not those of his co-religionists, but as I said, it's the militias that are refusing to give up power. Everybody in Libya, to a degree, some degree or another, is saying that Islam is the answer. That's not the problem. The problem for him is a lack of effective power. It's a nice split screen effect. And the name at the bottom is Mohammed Morsi Mubarak. I've run it all together to suggest that poor old Mohammed Morsi is part of the Mubarak family. I'm not saying that he couldn't have done better during his time in power, but it's not as though he's been there as long as Mubarak was. And the country, the problems that the country of Egypt is facing today are definitely more of Mubarak's making than they are of Morsi's making. I think, to be fair, we should have that there. I said it was going to be a simple conclusion today, rather than one of those multi-bullet pointed conclusions that I tend to favour. And it's this. The forms of Islam are as diverse and numerous as the social and political challenges facing those who want to be seen ruling in its name. I think if you read that again and understand that that pretty much is the single thread that's run through everything we've said this evening, you will be better able, I hope, going forward, to understand and to treat the subject with the degree of nuance that is missing in so much of the coverage I read, at least, both inside Washington and out of it. And with that, I will say thank you.